Elena stood in the communication room at dawn, her brother's research files clutched in her hands. She had spent the entire night walking the deck, thinking about the choice that would define not just her life, but possibly the future of everyone. Still alive on Earth, the crew had gathered around her, their faces showing the exhaustion of a sleepless night spent in heated debate. They all knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would change everything. "I've made my decision," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the small space. "We're going to broadcast everything. Miguel's complete research, the manufacturing instructions, the warnings about proper preparation, all of it, on every frequency we can reach." Captain Torres stepped forward. "Elena, once we do this, there's no going back. Every group with a radio will have this information within hours." "I know," she replied, surprising herself with how calm she felt. "But my brother wrote that if humanity was going to survive, it had to be humanity that made the choice. Not governments, not military forces, not corporations, people." Dr. Chun had already started preparing the data files for transmission. "It's going to take about 6 hours to broadcast everything properly. We'll need to repeat it multiple times to make sure it gets through clearly." Antonio was setting up his equipment when his radio crackled to life. Colonel Davidson's voice came through, sharp and demanding. "Esperanza, this is Elmendorf Base. We've detected unusual activity in your area. You need to proceed to our coordinates immediately for your own safety." Elena picked up the microphone. "Colonel, we appreciate your concern, but we've decided on a different course of action." There was a pause before Davidson responded, his voice now cold and threatening. "Dr. Vasquez, I'm ordering you to report to this base immediately. That research is too important to be left in civilian hands." "With respect, Colonel," Elena replied, "you have no authority over this vessel or this crew. We're in international waters." The radio went silent, but Elena knew that silence wasn't good news. She looked at Antonio. "How long before we can start broadcasting?" "Give me 20 minutes to set up the wideband transmission," he replied, his fingers flying over his controls. Those 20 minutes felt like the longest of Elena's life. She found herself thinking about Miguel, wondering if he would approve of what she was about to do. His research had been hidden away for 3 years while the world burned. Now she was about to give it to everyone at once. Dr. Chun appeared beside her with a tablet showing the final data package. "I've included simplified instructions that local laboratories should be able to follow, warnings about the dangers of improper preparation and detailed safety protocols. It's everything someone would need to produce the cure safely." "What about people who might want to misuse it?" Lisa asked. Elena had thought about this all night. The same information that can save lives can potentially harm them, but keeping it secret hasn't protected anyone so far. Maybe trusting people to do the right thing is the only choice we have left. Antonio's voice cut through their conversation. "I'm picking up radio traffic. Multiple sources, all headed in our direction. Ships, probably military based on their communication patterns." Torres grabbed his binoculars and headed for the deck. When he returned, his face was grim. "3 vessels on the horizon, moving fast. They'll be here within the hour." Elena felt her heart racing, but her resolve only strengthened. "Antonio, are we ready to broadcast?" "Ready when you are," he replied. Elena took a deep breath and began speaking into the microphone that would carry her voice to anyone still listening in a broken world. "This is Dr. Elena Vasquez aboard the research vessel Esperanza. To anyone receiving this transmission, I'm about to share information that could save what's left of our world. 3 years ago, my brother Dr. Miguel Vasquez and his team discovered both the cause of our current global crisis and the means to fix it." As she spoke, Elena could see the approaching ships growing larger on the horizon. But Antonio's equipment was already sending out the data files, broadcasting them on every frequency he could access. "The cure I'm transmitting requires careful preparation," Elena continued. "Please follow the safety protocols exactly. An improperly prepared cure could make the situation worse. But if prepared correctly, this information can help communities around the world begin to heal." Dr. Chun had taken over a second radio, broadcasting the technical data while Elena provided the explanation. The information was going out faster than any military force could stop it. The first ship to reach them flew no flag Elena recognized. Armed men in military gear attempted to board the Esperanza, demanding that they cease all transmissions immediately. Captain Torres met them at the gangway. "Too late," he told them with a slight smile. "The information's already out there." Elena watched from the bridge as more ships arrived. Some were clearly military, others looked like they might be private, security forces, or even pirates drawn by the promise of valuable cargo. But it didn't matter anymore. Antonio's equipment had been broadcasting for over an hour, and radio operators around the world were already retransmitting the information within 6 hours. Elena received confirmation that research facilities in Australia, Japan, and several European islands had received the complete data package. Universities that had managed to stay operational were already beginning to study the cure formulation. But the most meaningful response came from an unexpected source. A scratchy voice speaking accented English came through on one of the emergency frequencies. "Dr. Vasquez, this is Dr. Patel at a field hospital in rural India. We received your transmission and have begun preparation of the cure using local resources. Our first batch was successful. We've treated 30 patients, and all are showing signs of recovery. You've given us hope." Similar reports began filtering in from around the world. Small communities with basic laboratory equipment were successfully producing the cure. It wasn't perfect, some attempts failed, and there were reports of groups struggling with the complex preparation process. But it was working. The military forces that had surrounded their ship gradually departed over the following days, realizing that their mission had become pointless. The information was spreading faster than anyone could contain it. Elena made the decision to head back toward shore, but not to any military base. Instead, she directed Captain Torres toward the California coast, where early reports suggested small communities of survivors were beginning to organize. 2 weeks later, the Esperanza limped into what used to be San Francisco Bay. The city was largely empty, but the harbor showed signs of new life. Small boats moved between improvised settlements, and smoke from cooking fires suggested that people were not just surviving, but beginning to rebuild. Elena established a floating laboratory using the ship as a base, traveling to coastal communities to help them implement the cure properly. Dr. Chun set up training programs to teach local people how to prepare and distribute the medicine safely. It wasn't easy. Many communities struggled with the complex chemistry involved. Some groups initially rejected help from outsiders, suspicious after months of isolation. There were territorial disputes and resource conflicts as different settlements competed for supplies. But slowly, gradually, the cure began to spread. Not through government distribution or military enforcement, but through a network of ordinary people helping their neighbors. Elena watched communities share knowledge, resources, and hope with each other in ways that reminded her why her brother had believed in humanity's capacity for goodness. 6 months after that first broadcast, Elena received a message that brought tears to her eyes. It was from Dr. Patel in India, the first person to confirm successful treatment using Miguel's research. "Dr. Vasquez," his message read, "I wanted you to know that we've now treated over 5,000 people in our region. The cure is working, and we're teaching others to make it. More importantly, we're sharing food, rebuilding schools, and planning for the future. Your brother's gift didn't just save lives, it reminded us how to be human again." Elena stood on the deck of the Esperanza, now permanently anchored in the bay that had become her new home. The ocean around her carried boats filled with people, working together to rebuild their world. The silence that had defined their journey had been replaced by the sounds of recovery, cooperation, and hope. She thought about Miguel often, wondering if he could see what his sacrifice had accomplished. The world wasn't the same as it had been before the crisis, and it might never be. But perhaps that wasn't entirely a bad thing. The new communities rising from the disaster seemed more connected, more aware of how much they needed each other. Elena pulled out the old photograph of Miguel that she still carried. In it, he was smiling, his arm around her shoulders, both of them young and certain that science could solve any problem. He had been right in the end. But the real solution hadn't been in the laboratory equipment or the complex formulas. It had been in the choice to trust that when people were given the tools they needed, they would choose to help rather than harm. The Esperanza rocked gently in the harbor, no longer a ship carrying survivors, but a beacon reminding everyone that, even in the darkest times, humanity's capacity for hope and cooperation could light the way home. Captain Maria Santos had been sailing these waters for 23 years, but she had never seen anything like this. The morning had started peaceful enough aboard the merchant vessel Aurora's Dream. Her crew of 32, along with 15 passengers heading to Iceland, were enjoying calm seas and clear skies. The weather forecast had mentioned some light rain, nothing more. But nature had other plans. By noon, the wind started picking up. Maria watched the barometer drop faster than she'd ever seen it fall. The radio crackled with urgent weather updates. From Maritime Control? A massive storm system had appeared out of nowhere, growing stronger by the hour. What started as a gentle breeze quickly turned into something much more dangerous. "Captain, we're getting reports of 60-mile-per-hour winds heading our way," called out James Chun, the ship's radio operator. His voice carried a hint of worry that Maria didn't like hearing. James had been with her for 8 years and rarely showed concern about weather. Maria studied the navigation charts spread across the bridge table. They were roughly 400 miles from the nearest port, sitting right in the path of what meteorologists were now calling a once-in-a-decade storm. The Aurora's Dream was a sturdy cargo ship, built to handle rough seas, but she was also 27 years old. Her engines were reliable but not powerful enough to outrun severe weather. "How long before it hits us?" Maria asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. "Weather service says 2 hours, maybe less," James replied, adjusting his headset as static filled the radio. "They're recommending all vessels in the area seek immediate shelter." The problem was simple. There was no shelter to seek. The nearest port was too far away, and the storm was moving faster than they could travel. Maria made the call that every sea captain dreads. She ordered all hands to prepare for heavy weather. The crew moved quickly, securing loose cargo and checking safety equipment. Passengers were told to remain in their cabins and keep their life jackets nearby. Everything that could move was tied down or stored away. The ship's cook, an elderly man named Pedro, who had sailed longer than anyone else aboard, quietly prepared extra food and hot coffee. He knew from experience that rough weather meant nobody would be eating regular meals. For a while, when the storm hit, it came with the force of a freight train. The first massive wave crashed over the Aurora's Dream's bow, sending spray across the entire length of the ship. Maria gripped the wheel tighter as the vessel climbed what felt like a mountain of water, then plunged down the other side with stomach-dropping speed. 30-foot waves and climbing," shouted Tony Reeves, the first officer, over the howling wind. Rain lashed against the bridge windows so hard that the wipers couldn't keep up. Visibility dropped to almost zero, but this was just the beginning. Within an hour, the waves had grown to 40 feet tall, towering walls of dark water that seemed to reach up toward the storm clouds above. The Aurora's Dream, weighing over 8,000 tons when fully loaded, was being tossed around like a toy boat in a bathtub. The real trouble started in the engine room. Chief Engineer Luis Martinez was making his regular rounds when he noticed water where there shouldn't be any. A small leak in the hull, probably caused by the constant pounding of the waves, had started letting seawater into the lower sections of the ship. "Captain, we've got flooding in compartment 3, Luis reported over the intercom, his voice strained from shouting over the noise of the engines and pumps. "Nothing we can't handle yet, but the pumps are working overtime." Maria felt her stomach drop, and it wasn't from the motion of the ship. Flooding during a storm was every captain's nightmare. If the pumps couldn't keep up with the incoming water, the ship would start listing to one side. Once that happened, stability became a serious problem. As if the ocean was listening to her fears. An enormous wave, bigger than any they'd encountered yet, slammed into the Aurora's Dream from the side. The entire ship rolled so far to starboard that dishes crashed in the galley and passengers screamed from their cabins. When the vessel finally rolled back upright, Maria knew they were in real trouble. "Engine room to bridge," came Luce's urgent voice. "The last wave damaged the main pump. We're taking on water faster than we can get rid of it." The situation was getting worse by the minute. The communications equipment, already struggling with the storm interference, started failing completely. James worked frantically with the radio, trying to maintain contact with the Coast Guard, but the electronics were getting soaked by spray, finding its way into every corner of the bridge. "I'm losing contact with rescue coordination," James reported, panic creeping into his voice. The antenna may have been damaged. Outside, the storm had become a monster. Waves now reached 50 feet in height, and the wind was screaming at over 80 miles per hour. The Aurora's Dream was taking a beating that no ship her age was meant to handle. With each massive wave, more water found its way inside, and the pumps were losing the fight. Dr. Helen Park, the ship's medical officer, appeared on the bridge looking pale. "Captain, I need to report injuries. 3 passengers have broken bones from being thrown around their cabins. 1 crew member has a possible concussion. And everyone's getting seasick. The motion is beyond what most people can handle." Maria nodded grimly. Injured people would complicate any rescue operation, assuming rescue was even possible in these conditions. She looked out at the chaos surrounding her ship and made a decision that went against every instinct she had as a captain. "All hands." "This is the captain," she announced over the ship's intercom, her voice steady despite the fear in her heart. "Prepare to abandon ship. This is not a drill. All crew and passengers report to lifeboat stations immediately." The announcement sent a chill through everyone aboard the Aurora's Dream, abandoning ship in calm. Weather was dangerous enough. Doing it in the middle of a raging storm was almost certainly a death sentence. But staying aboard a sinking vessel was guaranteed suicide. As the crew and passengers gathered at the lifeboat stations, wearing their bright orange life jackets and clutching whatever belongings they could carry, Maria took one last look around the bridge of the ship that had been her home for so many years. The Aurora's Dream was listing heavily now, and water was beginning to wash across the main deck with each wave. The lifeboats themselves were damaged. 2 had been crushed by debris, and the remaining ones looked far too small and fragile to survive in the massive seas surrounding them. But there was no choice left. The ship was going down, and their only hope was to get as far away from it as possible before it pulled them down with it. As the first lifeboat was lowered into the churning water, Maria said a silent prayer to whatever powers might be listening. 47 souls were about to be cast into one of the most violent storms ever recorded in these waters. Hundreds of miles from help, with communication equipment that no longer worked, they were completely alone in the middle of the ocean, and nobody knew exactly where they were. The first thing that hit them was the cold. Not just regular cold, but the kind that goes straight through your clothes and into your bones. The Atlantic Ocean in this part of the world was always freezing, but being soaked to the skin made it feel like ice water was running through their veins. Maria found herself in lifeboat number 3 with 12 other people, including Dr. Helen Park and engineer Luis Martinez. The small orange boat rode the massive waves like a cork, climbing up walls of water that seemed to stretch forever, then dropping down the other side so fast that several people lost their dinner. The rain continued to pound them, and every few minutes another wave would crash over the side, soaking everyone again just when they thought they might start to dry off. "Stay low and hold on," Maria shouted over the wind, though her voice could barely be heard above the storm. She had to grab the shoulder of Mrs. Chun, an elderly passenger who was sitting next to her when a particularly large wave nearly threw the woman overboard. The old lady's face was already turning pale from the cold, and her lips had a blue tint that Maria didn't like seeing. In the other lifeboats scattered across the angry sea, the rest of the Aurora's Dream's crew and passengers were fighting their own battles against the elements. Radio operator James was in boat number 1 with Captain Rodriguez from the passenger manifest, along with Cook Pedro and several others. James clutched the emergency radio like his life depended on it, which it probably did. Mayday, Mayday. This is Aurora's dream, James called into the radio for the 100th time, his voice getting weaker from shouting. 47 souls in lifeboats, approximately 400 miles northeast of Iceland. We need immediate assistance. But all he got back was static. The storm was interfering with radio signals, and their small emergency transmitter didn't have enough power to reach very far. Even if someone heard them, the lifeboats were being pushed around by the current and wind. Their exact location was anybody's guess. The worst part was watching the Aurora's dream go down. The ship that had been their home and protection was now tilted at such a sharp angle that her deck was almost vertical. With each wave, more of the vessel disappeared beneath the dark water. When she finally slipped under completely, it felt like watching a friend die. Some of the passengers started crying, not just from fear, but from the reality that their last connection to safety was gone forever. By the second hour in the water, the real problems began. Mrs. Chun, despite Dr. Park's best efforts to keep her warm, had stopped shivering. This wasn't a good sign. When people get too cold, their bodies stop trying to warm themselves up. It means they're running out of energy to fight. We need to keep her awake, Dr. Park told Maria, checking the elderly woman's pulse. Talk to her. Keep her responding. If she falls asleep now, she might not wake up, but keeping someone conscious. In a tiny boat being thrown around by 50-foot waves was easier said than done. Mrs. Chin's eyes kept closing, and her responses to questions were getting slower and weaker. By the third hour, she had stopped responding altogether. Dr. Park checked for a pulse, then slowly shook her head. The first life had been claimed by the merciless cold. In lifeboat number 2, passenger Robert Kim, a businessman who had been traveling to Iceland for a conference, was having similar problems. The young man had seemed healthy and strong when they abandoned ship, but hypothermia doesn't care about age or fitness. His body temperature had dropped too low, and despite the efforts of the others in his boat to keep him warm, he slipped away just before dawn. James continued working the radio, though his hands were so cold he could barely operate the controls. Every few minutes he would try again, changing frequencies, adjusting the antenna, doing anything he could think of to get a signal out. Finally, just as the sun was starting to rise on their second day in the water, he made contact. Emergency. Emergency, this is Coast Guard Station Reykjavik, came a voice through the static. We're receiving a weak signal. Please identify yourself and your position. James's heart jumped with hope. This is Aurora's dream emergency. 47 people, now 45 in lifeboats. We're somewhere northeast of Iceland, maybe 400 miles out. We've lost 2 to hypothermia and have multiple people in critical condition. The Coast Guard operator's voice was professional but not encouraging. Aurora's dream, we have your approximate position. Be advised, current weather conditions have grounded all search aircraft. Surface vessels cannot operate safely in your area. Can you maintain your current position? Maintain their position? James almost laughed, but it came out as more of a sob. They had no control over where the lifeboats went. The wind and current were pushing them wherever nature wanted. Some of the boats had already drifted so far apart that they could barely see each other on the horizon. Negative on maintaining position, James replied. We're drifting with the current. Storm conditions are severe. We have injured people and limited supplies. Understood, Aurora's dream. Continue monitoring this frequency. We're working on rescue options, but it may be several hours before we can reach you. Several hours. James looked around at the people in his lifeboat. Cook Pedro was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular. 2 of the passengers were showing serious signs of hypothermia. Several hours might as well be several days for some of these people. The sun climbing higher in the sky should have been encouraging, but the storm clouds blocked most of its warmth. The waves had gotten smaller, maybe 30 feet instead of 50, but they were still big enough to keep everyone soaked and miserable. Salt water had gotten into cuts and scrapes, making them burn. People were getting dehydrated despite being surrounded by water, because drinking seawater would only make things worse. In Maria's boat, engineer Luis was trying to keep everyone's spirits up by telling stories about his hometown in Mexico, describing sunny beaches and warm weather. But his voice was getting weaker, and even he couldn't hide the worry in his eyes when he looked at some of the passengers. Dr. Park was doing everything she could with the limited medical supplies they had managed to grab from the ship, but treating hypothermia in a lifeboat was nearly impossible. She needed warm, dry conditions and proper equipment. All she could do was try to keep people awake and moving, sharing body heat, and hoping help would arrive soon. By afternoon of the second day, the situation was desperate. They had now lost 3 people to the cold, and at least 6 others were in serious trouble. The lifeboats had drifted further apart, making it harder to coordinate any kind of rescue. James's radio was still working, but the Coast Guard had no good news to share. The storm was still too severe for helicopters, and no surface ships in the area were equipped to handle the conditions. As the sun started to set on their second day in the lifeboats, Maria looked around at the exhausted, frightened faces of the people depending on her. Some were starting to talk about giving up, about just letting the ocean take them. She couldn't blame them. They were cold, scared, and running out of hope, but somewhere deep inside, Maria still believed that help would come. It had to come. The alternative was too terrible to think about. 800 miles away from the desperate survivors, the USS Leviathan cut through the water like a knife through silk. This wasn't just any ordinary Navy ship. The Leviathan was something special, something that most people didn't even know existed. She was part of a secret program designed to create the most advanced rescue and defense vessel ever built. Commander Mitchell stood on the bridge, watching her crew work with the precision that came from months of training together. They had been testing new weapon systems in a classified area of the North Atlantic when the emergency call came through. The message was encrypted, which meant it was serious business. When Mitchell decoded it, she couldn't believe what she was reading. 47 civilians in lifeboats, severe hypothermia, multiple casualties already confirmed, she read aloud to her senior officers. Location approximately 400 miles northeast of Iceland. All conventional rescue assets unavailable due to weather conditions. Lieutenant Commander Torres, the ship's executive officer, studied the weather reports on his screen. "Ma'am, those conditions are beyond what most ships can handle. Wind speeds over 80 miles per hour, waves still hitting 40 feet. The Coast Guard has grounded everything." Mitchell looked at the data herself. Any normal ship would never attempt a rescue in those conditions. The risk would be too great, not just to the rescue vessel, but to the people they were trying to save. But the Leviathan wasn't a normal ship. "What's our current speed and heading?" Mitchell asked her navigation officer. 32 knots, ma'am, heading northeast toward the test zone boundary. Change course immediately. Set heading for the emergency. Coordinates, and I want maximum speed. The helmsman looked uncertain. "Ma'am, maximum speed in these conditions?" Mitchell's voice was firm. "You heard me, sailor. This ship was built for exactly this kind of situation. Time to see what she can really do." The Leviathan had been designed using technology that was years ahead of anything else on the water. Her hull was made from a special composite material that could flex with the waves instead of fighting them. The propulsion system used advanced engineering that allowed her to maintain incredible speeds even in rough seas. Most importantly, she had stabilization systems that could keep the ship level when other vessels would be rolling helplessly. As the massive destroyer changed course and increased speed, the difference between her and ordinary ships became obvious. Where other vessels would struggle to make 20 knots in these conditions, the Leviathan smoothly accelerated to 45 knots. The waves that would have pounded a conventional ship seemed to part around her specially designed bow. Chief Engineer Rodriguez monitored the engines from the main engineering space. He had worked on ships for 15 years, but nothing had prepared him for the Leviathan's power systems. Engine room to bridge, he reported over the intercom. All systems running perfectly. We're maintaining 45 knots with power to spare, but speed was only part of what made the Leviathan special. In the ship's medical bay, Dr. Williams was preparing for what could be the largest rescue operation the new vessel had ever attempted. The medical facilities aboard the destroyer were more advanced than most hospitals on land. They had equipment for treating severe hypothermia, trauma surgery capabilities, and enough space to handle dozens of patients at once. Doctor, what's your assessment of the survivor's condition? Mitchell asked over the ship's communication system. Dr. Williams checked his notes from the emergency transmission. Based on the reports, Commander, we're looking at severe hypothermia in most cases. Some people have been in near freezing water for over 30 hours. At that point, we're racing against organ failure and cardiac arrest. Every minute counts. Mitchell studied the navigation display showing their progress toward the emergency coordinates. Even at maximum speed, they were still 18 hours away from the survivors. 18 hours was a long time for people floating in the North Atlantic in small boats. Communications, get me a direct line to Coast Guard rescue coordination, Mitchell ordered. I want to know everything they know about the current condition of those survivors. The radio operator worked quickly to establish contact. Within minutes, Mitchell was speaking directly to the Coast Guard officer coordinating the rescue effort from Iceland. Commander, this is Captain Hansen with Rescue Coordination. Are you certain your vessel can operate in those conditions? We've had to turn back 3 ships already. The weather is beyond what most vessels can handle safely. Mitchell looked around her bridge at the calm, professional faces of her crew. Outside, the storm was getting worse as they approached the disaster area, but the Leviathan was handling the rough seas like they were a minor inconvenience. Captain Hansen, I appreciate your concern, but the Leviathan is specifically designed for operations in extreme conditions. We can handle whatever nature throws at us. What I need from you is the most recent contact with the survivors. Last contact was 6 hours ago. They reported losing 3 people to hypothermia and had 6 others in critical condition. The radio operator said several of the lifeboats had drifted apart and they couldn't see each other anymore. This news hit Mitchell like a punch to the stomach. People were dying while she raced to reach them. The Leviathan was the most advanced ship in the world, but even she couldn't travel faster than physics allowed. Understood, Captain Hansen. We'll maintain radio contact and provide updates on our approach. Mitchell turned to her operations officer. I want every piece of rescue equipment on this ship checked and double-checked. Life rafts, medical supplies, rescue boats, everything. When we reach those people, I want to be ready for the largest rescue operation this ship has ever seen. The operations officer nodded and began coordinating with department heads throughout. The ship, the Leviathan, carried specialized rescue equipment that most people had never heard of. She had rescue pods that could operate in seas that would destroy ordinary lifeboats. Her crane systems could lift people from the water in conditions where helicopters couldn't fly. She even had experimental warming chambers designed specifically for treating severe hypothermia. As the hours passed, the weather continued to deteriorate. The Leviathan was now pushing through waves that reached 45 feet in height, with wind speeds approaching 90 miles per hour. Any other ship would have been forced to reduce speed or change course to avoid the worst of the storm. But the advanced destroyer continued cutting through the chaos at full speed. Ma'am, we're now 12 hours from the emergency coordinates, reported the navigation officer. Current speed holding steady at 45 knots. Mitchell checked the latest weather reports. The storm was actually getting worse, not better. The survivors had now been in the water for over 40 hours. She thought about the people floating somewhere ahead in the darkness, fighting for their lives in conditions that would kill most people in hours, not days. Engine room, this is the bridge. I need everything you can give me. Can we push the engines any harder? Chief Engineer Rodriguez's voice came back immediately. Commander, these engines were designed for exactly this situation. I can give you another 3 knots, but I wouldn't recommend it in normal circumstances. These aren't normal circumstances, Chief. Give me everything you've got. The Leviathan surged forward as her engines increased power. 48 knots through mountainous seas in near-hurricane conditions. It was a speed that should have been impossible, but the advanced ship made it look easy. Mitchell stood at the bridge windows, watching the massive waves crash against the reinforced glass. Somewhere out there in the storm, 44 people were depending on her and her crew. The Leviathan was their only hope, and Mitchell was determined not to let them down. "All hands, this is the commander," she announced over the ship's communication system. "We are approaching what may be the most challenging rescue operation any of us will ever face. But this ship and this crew were built for exactly this moment. We will not fail." The fortress was awakening, and she was hungry for a fight against the sea itself. When the Leviathan finally reached the disaster area, what Commander Mitchell saw through her binoculars made her heart sink. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, covered with massive waves and thick storm clouds. At first there was nothing visible except angry water and driving rain. No orange lifeboats, no survivors, no signs that anyone had ever been here at all. "Radar contact bearing 027, called out the radar operator, his voice cutting through the tension on the bridge. "Small craft, approximately 2 miles out." Mitchell grabbed her binoculars and focused on the coordinates. There, riding up and down the massive swells like a tiny cork, was a single orange lifeboat. Even from this distance, she could see it was riding dangerously low in the water, probably taking on water faster than the people inside could bail it out. "I count only 3 lifeboats visible," reported the lookout. Original reports mentioned 7 boats with 47 people. The reality hit everyone on the bridge at the same time. 4 lifeboats were missing, which meant at least 16 people were already gone. The remaining survivors had been fighting for their lives for over 42 hours in conditions that would kill most people in half that time. "Launch rescue operations immediately," Mitchell ordered. "Deploy rescue pods 1 and 2. I want our best swimmers in the water." The Leviathan's rescue pods were unlike anything the Navy had ever used before. They looked like small submarines, but could operate on the surface in conditions where normal boats would be destroyed instantly. Each pod was heavily armored and equipped with its own stabilization system. More importantly, they could maintain position next to a lifeboat even in 50-foot seas. Chief Petty Officer Wilson climbed into the first rescue pod with his team of specialist rescue swimmers. Wilson had been saving lives at sea for 12 years, but he'd never attempted a rescue in conditions like this. As the pod was lowered into the churning water, he could feel the incredible power of the ocean trying to tear his small craft apart. "Rescue. Pod 1 to bridge," Wilson reported over his radio. "We're in the water and heading for the first lifeboat. Visibility is near 0, but we have them on our instruments." In the first lifeboat they reached, Wilson found 8 people clinging to life. Captain Maria Santos was still conscious, but barely. Her lips were blue from the cold, and her hands shook so badly she couldn't hold on to the rope Wilson threw. To her, Engineer Luis Martinez was unconscious in the bottom of the boat, covered by life jackets that his fellow survivors had piled on top of him to keep him warm. "This one's in bad shape," Wilson told his team as they carefully lifted Luis into the rescue pod. "He's not responding, core temperature probably critical. We need to get him to the medical bay immediately." Dr. Park was in slightly better condition, but she was so weak that she needed help climbing from the lifeboat into the rescue pod. "There are 2 more boats out there," she whispered to Wilson, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Maybe 12 people still alive. Please find them." The second rescue pod, commanded by Petty Officer Johnson, located the next lifeboat almost a mile away. This boat was in even worse condition. It was taking on water faster than the survivors could bail it out, and it was clear that it would sink within the hour. Radio operator James Chun was still trying to work his emergency radio, even though his hands were so cold he could barely move his fingers. "Help is here," Johnson called out as his pod approached the sinking lifeboat. "We're going to get you out of there." But transferring people from a sinking lifeboat to a rescue pod in 40-foot seas was incredibly dangerous work. Every wave threatened to smash the two craft together or flip one of them completely over. Johnson's crew had to time each transfer perfectly, grabbing survivors during the brief moments when both vessels were stable. Cook, Pedro had to be lifted unconscious from the bottom of the lifeboat. He hadn't spoken or moved in over 6 hours, and his breathing was so shallow that Johnson wasn't sure he was still alive. Passenger Robert Kim's wife was crying uncontrollably, not from fear but from relief that someone had finally come to save them. Meanwhile, aboard the Leviathan, Dr. Williams and his medical team were preparing for the largest emergency operation in the ship's history. The advanced medical bay had been converted into a trauma center, with warming stations set up for hypothermia, patients and surgical equipment ready for any serious injuries. The first survivors brought aboard were in critical condition. Luis Martinez's core body temperature had dropped so low that normal warming techniques wouldn't work. Dr. Williams had to use the ship's experimental warming chambers, devices that could gradually raise a person's body temperature without shocking their system. His heart rate is dangerously slow, Dr. Williams told his team as they worked on Lee's. The cold has basically put his body into survival mode. We need to warm him very slowly or we could cause cardiac arrest. Dr. Park, despite her own condition, insisted on helping treat the other survivors. She knew each person's medical history and what they had been through during their time in the lifeboats. Her knowledge proved invaluable as the medical team worked to save lives. Mrs. Chun was diabetic, Dr. Park explained as the medical team examined the elderly woman. She hadn't had her medication in over 2 days. The stress and cold have probably sent her blood sugar dangerously high. The search for the third lifeboat took longer than anyone had hoped. The storm was actually getting worse instead of better, and visibility was down to less than 100 yards. The rescue pods used every instrument they had, from radar to heat sensors, trying to locate the missing survivors. "There," shouted Petty Officer Wilson, pointing through the rain and spray. 2 o'clock, about 300 yards. The third lifeboat was barely staying afloat. It had lost most of its emergency equipment, and the 7 people inside were huddled together in the bottom, sharing body heat in a desperate attempt to stay alive. Among them was a young mother with her 10-year-old daughter, both so cold they could barely speak. This rescue was the most dangerous yet. The lifeboat was listing heavily to one side and taking on water with every wave. Wilson knew they had only minutes before it would sink completely, taking everyone aboard down with it. "We're going to have to work fast," Wilson told his team. "That boat won't last much longer." One by one, the rescue swimmers pulled the survivors from the sinking lifeboat. The young girl was so scared she didn't want to let go of her mother, and both had to be lifted together. An elderly passenger had to be carried unconscious, his body completely limp from the cold dot as the last survivor was pulled from the lifeboat. It finally gave up its fight against the ocean. The small orange craft that had kept 7 people alive for over 40 hours disappeared beneath the waves, swallowed by the same sea that had claimed so many others. Back aboard the Leviathan, the medical bay was a scene of controlled chaos. Dr. Williams and his team worked on patient after patient, fighting to save people who had been at death's door. Some were responding well to treatment, slowly warming up and regaining consciousness. Others were still in critical condition, their bodies pushed beyond what they were meant to endure. "We've got 23 survivors aboard," Dr. Williams reported to Commander Mitchell. 15 are stable and responding well to treatment. 8 are still critical, but I think we can save them all if we can get them to a proper hospital soon. Mitchell felt a mixture of relief and sadness. 23 people saved, but 24 others lost to the merciless sea. Still, it was more than anyone had thought possible when the rescue operation began. The Leviathan turned toward Iceland, her powerful engines pushing through the storm toward the nearest hospital facilities. In her medical bay, survivors slowly began to realize that their nightmare was finally over.